Hi there. Today, we're gonna explore a Japanese drama/romance film called Parasite in Love. This movie is centered around the budding feelings between a young man named Kigo Kasaka and a young high school student named Hajiri Sanagi. Both of them deal with inner fears and phobias that make them feel like outsiders around other people. Kasaka is a germaphobe, thus whenever he interacts with people, he can see their faces covered with contamination and germs. His hands also start looking like they are diseased, so he has to wash them constantly. Because of that, he has trouble developing relationships with other people and has no friends. Sanagi, on the other hand, has a fear of being stared at, so whenever she looks at people it's like their eyes are popping out of their skulls when they look at her. This has given rise to feelings of anxiety and restlessness that also make it difficult for her to form relationships. This movie is based on a popular Japanese novel released in 2016. It begins with a young man sitting at his computer. This is Kigo Kasaka, and he is working hard to create a virus that would infect other people's devices. Any device infected by this particular virus would lose all its communication networks, rendering the world into chaos, and all lovers would feel his despair. It is his way of getting back at the world that never sought to understand how it felt being him, to have a crippling phobia that would force him to run away from people. He looks out of the window and fantasizes about the buildings exploding around him. The world must have really done a number on him. He thinks back to when his phobia began. He was 8 years old and had found both his parents to have willingly kicked the bucket. Ever since then, he has found the skin of his hands breaking out as if from a disease. He has been pretty much a loner since then. He recalls a time when he accidentally caught a ball thrown in his direction at a high school match and immediately lost consciousness. The school's sports teacher had tried to revive him despite the students' warnings not to touch him, but the teacher had not taken heed. To Kasaka's horror, he had woken up in his teacher's arms, staring at the teacher's face as it broke with some strange fungus-like contamination. This makes him break out of his grip and puke on the gym floor. All the students started jeering him about his behavior, so he ran away. They had found him weird and gross, so he was also going to show them all what it felt like to be him. Moving on with the story, we find Kasaka riding a bus. From where he's standing, he notices a man sitting near him. The man has utterly disgusting mannerisms as he keeps burping and licking his fingers while guzzling down a sandwich. This makes Kasaka nauseous. Others may easily ignore this, but to him, it is like standing in a river of sewage filth. He panics and gets off the bus, vomiting his guts out. At that moment, we are introduced to Hajiri Sanagi, who happens to catch a look at him walking by. She is in her high school uniform and narrates to the audience that she always had a fear of looking into other people's eyes. Whenever she walks by, it is like the disgusting, sight-giving orbs are ogling at her. In the playground, when a ball lands near her face, she cannot bring herself to look into the happy, cheerful faces of the children calling out for her to toss the ball back. It makes her upset and she kicks the ball in the opposite direction. She recalls how when she was young, her father had told her about her illness. Its name was scopophobia and her mother had it as well. That's why she passed away, because the parasite would grow by feeding on the brain. Sanagi believes that someday the same would happen to her. Her father had explained to her that it was like a sleeping parasite nesting in her brain. It may choose to wake up at any time. When she nervously turns to look at him, his eyes get larger as if they would pop right out of his skull. The mental phobia had a way of transforming the world around her. People's eyes in the picture frames would droop and stare at her. Large eyes would pop out of the walls of her surroundings, following her and making her feel like they were watching her every move. Being around people made her uncomfortable, so she would outright reject their company. Kasaka has collapsed on the pavement after vomiting, and Sanagi is the only one around who can help him. Sanagi takes him to her father, who is actually a doctor. When he regains consciousness, Kasaka is told by the old doctor that if he had arrived any later, he could have died, so his blood samples had been taken without his will. Kasaka leaves the hospital after regaining some strength, wondering why the world kept him alive. He finds solace in imagining the world burning around him. Sanagi, meanwhile, watches him secretly as he leaves the hospital. She can tell that he carries the same sense of despair that she does. One day, after taking a shower, Kasaka is startled to discover a man sitting in his room and going through his computer. He immediately panics because, 1, a stranger is in his house, and 2, he cannot bear the presence of another person contaminating his room. The man is unbothered by Kasaka's reaction and offers him 2 choices. Either he can agree to work with him and take care of a kid for 2 months for 500,000 yen, or he can get sent to jail for creating a virus that would disrupt people's lives. Feeling like his hands are tied behind his back, Kasaka cannot do anything but agree to the strange man's conditions. The man tells him he would find the kid at Mizushina Park at 3 p.m. To nobody's surprise, the kid in question is Hajiri Sanagi. She has no clue why she's involved in this shady business. Her only concern is to get half of what Kasaka would be paid by that man. To earn sympathy points, she informs him that she's ill and would die soon. Kasaka reluctantly accepts her terms and takes her back to his apartment. Without asking permission, she shoves her way inside. Kasaka tries to stop her but is helpless against her robustness. He watches her, terrified, as she goes through his stuff, sits on his computer chair, does everything to disturb his clean room and plonks herself onto his bed. Kasaka is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He can see germs spreading everywhere like a virus, and accidentally pushes her when she tries to help him. She bangs her head against the wall and leaves his apartment utterly offended. Meanwhile, Kosaka has difficulty trying to decide his next move. He takes a rapid shower and throws his bedsheets and clothes in the washing machine. With manic energy, he starts mopping the floor of his room and wipes everything clean. The man calls him and Kosaka tells him he cannot take more of this and wants to quit. The man is unconcerned and warns him that if he doesn't treat Tsunagi right, he would face consequences worse than a mere prosecution. Later, the man hands him another assignment. Kosaka has to find out why Tsunagi wasn't attending high school. Kosaka just thinks that Tsunagi is careless and probably doesn't care about going to high school, but the man tells him to be aware of others' pain as well as his own. He tells him to mind his own business when Kosaka wants to know why he's doing this. There's a series of loud kicks on the door while Kosaka is sleeping. Kosaka goes to check only to find Tsunagi outside his apartment eating a hot dog. Kosaka keeps the door shut and explains to her the rules of entering his house. She has to finish her hot dog, sanitize her hands, and wear slippers first before stepping in. Tsunagi doesn't care about his rules at all. She enters his apartment and ignores him as he fumbles around panicking and screaming. She kicks off her shoes, and when Kosaka starts rushing to place them outside, she starts jumping on his bed. This causes the germaphobe severe nausea and he passes out again in a pool of vomit. Kosaka wakes up to find himself shirtless on his bed. Tsunagi tells him that she cleaned him up when he passed out. Kosaka is surprised at this act of kindness from her, and it prompts him to tell her about his illness. He tells her he suffers from severe germophobia that makes it difficult for him to interact with others properly. Once, he recounts, his girlfriend had made him food, and he had vomited immediately after taking a bite. He cannot forget the look of contempt she gave him at that. All this time, Tsunagi has refused to face him, and her only response is to tell him how pathetic she finds him. She leaves, but outside the apartment door, she huddles her back against it as her anxiety rises up madly. She tries hard to control her heart rate and breathing, but upon touching her nose, she realizes she has a nosebleed. The next day, Kosaka calls her to meet him at a cafe near the ATM. There he hands her an envelope with money inside. Tsunagi tells him she hates public places like this. Kosaka asks her what she would do with all this money, and she indifferently replies that she'd probably run away from home. She has this uncanny habit of acting like a social rebel, especially to shock others like Kosaka. They take a walk together in some place. We cannot really tell what it is. It looks like a town square at first, but could easily be a mall as well. There, Tsunagi asks him if he likes cats. When he says no, she tells him that he probably doesn't have toxoplasma, a parasite carried by cats which can control the brains of mice and manipulate them into liking cats instead of staying away. Apparently, humans can be affected by it as well. Kosaka tries to ask her casually why she didn't attend high school, and she immediately asks him if Izumi had told him to ask her that. Kosaka tries to deflect that statement by telling her she needn't answer truthfully. Any answer would be okay to satiate this guy called Izumi. However, she doesn't like to lie. Her rebellious nature likes to kick in now and then, so she asks him if he wants to sleep with her. Of course, he replies no. He probably can't say yes in this situation even if he wanted to. She finds that boring and tells him that they were all going to die one day. What were his thoughts about dying? Kosaka just replies that he promised himself to never resort to. She asks him what he wanted to do to a society that had chosen to ignore and torment them. Was he ever going to seek revenge? But Kosaka decides to take a noble route in answering. He tells her he doesn't want to seek revenge since he has no regrets. He has already given up on everything and everyone. He tells her that maybe she's enjoying life in her own way, and that comment rubs her off in the wrong way. She leaves saying that maybe they were not compatible at all. Walking back through the woods and towards a tunnel, some guys on a motorbike assault Tsunagi. They rip away the bag from her shoulder and take away her headphones. This causes her to go into a panic attack because without headphones she cannot ignore the people around her. She falls onto the floor, and some people try to help her, but they seem like aliens to her with their eyes popping out of their skulls. She yells for them to stay away and runs. While Kosaka is working away on building his virus, he receives a desperate call from Tsunagi. She knows he doesn't give a damn about her, but now she desperately needs him. Hearing her scream and yell on the phone worries him, and he runs after his waifu. He cycles around the city trying to reach her as fast as possible. Perhaps a taxi or a bus would have gotten him to her sooner. He finds her an hour or two later on the rooftop of a strange building. Cautiously, he approaches her and hands her the butterfly keychain she had dropped earlier. Upon being questioned, she describes to him how she was assaulted and her things got stolen. She then tells him that without her headphones she cannot ignore people and their staring faces. Their eyes make her feel threatened, as if someone was forcing to invade her privacy. Kosaka deeply relates to her and tells her he's exactly like her. He sits down next to her and says he would stay with her as long as she liked. Together, they ride the sad bicycle back home when she feels better. In the next scene, Kosaka wonders why he's still alive even when the world continues to reject him. He looks up videos of other couples, hugging, kissing, and hanging out together, which is creepy at best if you ask me. Maybe all he needs is some fresh air and a 2-hour sit in the sun. Staring at the videos, Kosaka comes to the conclusion that his only way of leaving a mark on this world is by releasing the virus. Right on cue, Izumi messages him to meet up. The two men take a walk in a park, and Kosaka tells him that Tsunagi has scopophobia, which is why she didn't choose to go to high school. Izumi is greatly intrigued. He is, however, more interested in knowing how close the two of them had gotten in this short span of time because it was very unlike Tsunagi to open up so quickly to anyone. He tells him to keep on hanging out with her in the same fashion but gravely warns Kosaka to keep his hands off her. There was to be no kissing, and no getting intimate with one another. Kosaka assures Izumi she's not even his type and the two men part ways. In the evening later, Kosaka meets up with Tsunagi and hands her his headphones. She gets concerned about making them dirty but he assures her it's okay. They both sit in a cafe together later on in the night, watching decorators put on Christmas decorations on the streets. They make small talk about seeing Christmas lights sometimes when suddenly Tsunagi's nose starts bleeding. She doesn't have a tissue to staunch the flow but smoothly, Kosaka pulls out a pack and offers it to her. He wants to know more about her illness, and she tells him that her mother also happened to have it. Only she chose to bite the dust when Tsunagi was in elementary school. Kosaka asks her if she was okay, and Tsunagi reveals that with him she feels that her paranoia eases up. She presses him to do normal things with her like riding a bus, going to a restaurant, eating and hanging out, but Kosaka pessimistically replies he finds that too challenging, and she ends up throwing a wrapper at him. Later, Tsunagi sits with a doctor who checks her blood pressure. He pulls off his mask, and it's revealed that the doctor is Izumi. He tells her that her scopophobia is progressively getting much better. The nosebleeds she's getting are actually a positive sign. Tsunagi still appears to be worried and tells him about strange feelings she's been experiencing in her heart lately. Izumi looks at her questioningly, but Tsunagi cracks up saying she was just playing with him. There was no way she was ever going to be in love. Izumi just sighs and tells her that with the appropriate treatment, she was sure to get better, even if her mother had chosen to kick the bucket. He then goes to meet up with her father, the head doctor, who is analyzing Kosaka's brain scans. From what he can tell, the worm in his brain is growing and in about a month it will fully mature. The doctor worries about the alarming rate at which people will attempt to take their own lives this year. Many of them, he believes, are going to be victims of worms just like Kosaka and Tsunagi. Izumi asks if they should tell Kosaka about the report, but the doctor disagrees. He thinks it'll affect the good progress of Tsunagi's treatment. Meanwhile, Kosaka and Tsunagi have decided to rehabilitate themselves with normal human society. They force themselves to take a bus ride, one morning, and then the next they sit in a cafe and order pizza. Tsunagi finds it difficult to connect with the waitress, let alone look her in the eyes. Yet, by concentrating on Kosaka, she is able to effectively give her order. Eating the pizza is difficult for Kosaka, but Tsunagi's relentless teasing allows him to at least swallow a mouthful without puking. They ultimately become close enough that Kosaka allows her to stay in his room while he works on his virus. As he tells her about his evil plan to release the virus on December 24th, she thinks he's crazy since all the couples who had planned to meet on Christmas Eve would be unable to do so because their communication gadgets would cease to function. He's like the Japanese equivalent of Mr. Grinch. Then Tsunagi has another brilliant idea. While everyone else is scrambling to figure out how to salvage their Christmas Eve arrangements, they will both go to visit the enormous Christmas tree. Despite Kosaka's concerns about the virus's completion ahead of schedule, she has him swear on it. Unbeknownst to them, Kosaka's room is bugged and Izumi is listening into every word they say. His job is to make sure Tsunagi and Kosaka don't get involved in anything kinkier than discussing how to build a virus that would disrupt the world order. The movie cuts to a montage showing them getting closer and spending more time with each other. They hang out in fields and cycle around the city while Tsunagi relentlessly teases him. One day, Tsunagi discusses a case of someone with severe toxoplasma. This particular guy happened to like cats way too much. He refused to socialize with others because he thought his life was all about spending time with cats. The doctors, however, had informed him that taking a new anti-parasitic would take care of the parasite in his brain and resolve all his problems. Kosaka finds her company endearing as well. One night, while the both of them sit at a bench, Kosaka opens up about how his parents had checked out of life when he was just 8 years old. Why had they chosen to give birth to him then if they had planned to leave him? This makes Tsunagi realize that they were exactly the same. A conclusion that they'd probably reach over and over again in the movie if you ask me. In the next scene, they are standing in a cafe attempting to yet again rehabilitate themselves back into human society. They are told by the cashier that if they buy a particular food deal, they also get a scratch card that could make them win tickets to Fantasy Island. Kosaka pays for the food and brings it over to Tsunagi. Before his very eyes, the burger grows strange little tentacles into which Tsunagi happily bites. Kosaka has a hard time trying to control the wave of nausea that washes over him. He tells her he is incapable of eating food that doesn't have a trace of its original form. She just rolls her eyes at him and his lack of attempt in integrating regular human habits. Just then she scratches the scratch card with a coin and finds out they've won the tickets. The movie cuts to a montage of them in the theme park, walking among the rides and giant flower decorations. They sit in bumping cars, much to Kasaka's distaste, and ride crazy rides. Sanagi offers him a lettuce leaf to feed the tortoise, but Kasaka just looks away. They sit in one of the theme park's open cafes and Sanagi receives a link from Kasaka. She gets excited, wanting to know if this was the website link that would release the virus. Kasaka just smiles and tells her to click on it. There, she discovers a game that looks like a duplicate version of Flappy Bird. Only instead of the bird, there is the same blue butterfly that is etched on Sanagi's keychain. She is touched by this gesture, but tells him that the blue character wasn't actually a butterfly. It was a parasite called diplozoid, a worm that infests koi fish, and has the ability to take away the eye of its host within 24 hours. It also happens to look like one, but it's actually two of them stuck together to create the shape of a butterfly. A bit confused by this onslaught of information from Encyclopedia Sanagi, they take the rest of the ride in silence. She continues to provide him with further information as they stroll through an exhibition venue. Diplozoid parasites were hermaphrodites that couldn't mature unless they mated with another larva. She compares their reliance on one another to that of a heyoku bird, a legendary creature with female and male equivalents, each with one eye and one wing fused together so it may fly. They fuse together for life, lay eggs, and if you drive them apart, they die. Perhaps the diplozoid represented Kasaka and Sanagi, two parasites who were slowly falling in love. On the bus ride home, Sanagi hands him the keychain for keeps. It is a payback for the game he had made for her. Kasaka decides to share one of his life's regrets, that he was always destined to be alone. With his phobia, he cannot see himself settling down with a wife and kids. If humans were meant to pass on their genes, why was he created? Sanagi just answers by putting his mask back on and tenderly kissing him. She tells him to stop thinking so pathetically about himself and goes back to stare out the window. They both ride the bus home in silence. When Sanagi reaches her home, she experiences another attack and gets a nosebleed. Inside, her father is waiting for her to arrive so he can tell her something important. He walks her to the couch and informs her that her treatment will begin the next day. He had worked feverishly for years, attempting to find a medicine, a cure that might eliminate Sanagi's parasite, but his efforts had been futile. But things were looking up, and he was certain he had the solution. Sanagi calmly listens but begs her father not to engage Kasaka in any of this. The doctor becomes irritated when he hears this. He thinks it is the parasite in her brain that's making her feel so strongly against using Kasaka. Even when she attempts to remind him that her actual sentiments may be at work here, he dismisses her, claiming he heard her mother say the same thing before she chose to die. She had been taken over by the parasite and had refused treatment. He reminds Sanagi that the parasite is growing in her brain. Did she not see how her conduct was becoming more impulsive each day, and how she was losing her sense of self? She would die if she allowed it to fester in her brain without treatment. At this point, Sanagi stands up and attempts to flee, resulting in a struggle. The doctor drags her back to her seat and gravely declares that the therapy will begin tomorrow, whether she likes it or not. Sanagi wonders aloud if he treated her mother similarly. Was it because of him that she chose to die? Sanagi cannot take more of this and runs away from home. Her heart is racing and the only place she knows she will find comfort is at Kasaka's. Meanwhile, Kasaka is on his computer looking up various parasites. He gets startled when Sanagi abruptly walks into his apartment and starts taking off her clothes. She strips off her high school jacket and shirt agitatedly, when suddenly she notices Kasaka's expression. They both slowly inch towards each other, and Kasaka tenderly gathers her in his arms and holds her to calm her down. After a while, Sanagi slowly pulls apart and they both reach in for a kiss, but just before their lips touch, she shoves him away, as if terrified. She wants to apologize for her behavior, knowing that she cannot be with him unless the parasite in her brain is successfully eliminated. And the thought makes her run away. Concerned, Kasaka tries to figure out what's going on but is helpless as she stubbornly leaves. He decides that the best course of action would be to call Izumi and find out exactly what's up. Thankfully, Izumi decides to trust Kasaka and picks him up in his car to take him to the hospital. On the way, he explains to Kasaka that both he and Sanagi share the same parasite in their brain. Startled to hear this, Kasaka almost pukes but Izumi supports him. He further explains that some humans find it difficult to adapt to society because there is a worm in their brain that can cause symptoms like social withdrawal, panic disorder, scopophobia, germophobia, and the like. This parasite is the reason why 70% of humans are unfit to integrate or function in normal human society. Izumi and Kasaka race inside the hospital hallways as Izumi explains how normal it can be to be affected by a parasite like that. After all, humans cannot survive without bacteria, and they have 100 trillion of them living inside them. When the parasite hosts inside a human body, it can try to torment the host by gradually taking control. Izumi predicts that Kasaka probably likes Sanagi but his sentiments towards her may be a result of the parasite at work. He tells him that the parasite has the capability to order the host's brain to find other hosts. It can make them believe that they are soulmates destined for each other, and manipulate their feelings into liking one another. Kasaka finds Tsunagi on a hospital bed. Dispiritedly, he decides to go straight to the point. The reason why Izumi had set both of them up was to make their worms grow. The treatment that her father had intended to perform upon Tsunagi was to try and remove the worm, but it had not been big enough. In order to reproduce, the parasites guide the hosts into being intimate with one another. This allowed them to copulate and lay eggs inside the body. Once the larvae hatch, they start devouring the host's body, causing the hosts to grow more and more mentally unstable, until they see no way out and cause themselves to die. Sadly, Kasaka figures out that the reason why both their phobias were easing up around each other was because the parasites subdue symptoms of anxiety once they start fully maturing. And he had been manipulated into thinking that it was only a result of his growing love for her. Tsunagi stares blankly at the room in silence as she tries to contemplate all this information. She then tells him she'd rather stay this way, happy and in love. Kasaka remembers Tsunagi telling him the story of the man that had developed a great love for cats due to a parasite in his brain. He remembers how even then, Tsunagi had posed the question of whether he'd find true happiness by throwing away his life that centered around them. In other words, had she been inadvertently trying to question her own happiness or what it would be without him? Was being normal the only way to achieve happiness? Back in his apartment, Kasaka now finds himself doubting his own words. Was he okay to get rid of his feelings and attempt to redo the same moments he had spent with her? Would those moments really carry the same meaning? He feels his heart squeeze at the prospect of losing her, but his train of thought gets interrupted when he receives a call from Izumi, asking him if Tsunagi was at his apartment. This immediately riles him into action and he runs out towards the hospital. At the hospital, Izumi sits forlornly and explains to Kasaka that the first worm carrier the doctor had discovered was his own daughter, Tsunaga's mother. Wait, so the old doctor was Tsunagi's grandfather all along? Considering how old he was, I'm surprised we didn't catch that sooner. Izumi then tells him that the doctor had offered treatment to his daughter as well, but she had refused. Back then, she had met Izumi after Tsunagi's birth and had fallen in love with him. Even though she was aware it was an illusion brought upon by the parasite in her brain, the two options that she faced, getting treated and losing her love for him, and refusing treatment and gradually dying by the hands of the parasite, plagued her to the extent that she chose death. The young doctor is afraid that Tsunagi was on the verge of following in her mother's footsteps. This terrible revelation causes Kasaka to go find her. He looks around the city in a panic until he comes upon the train station. Thankfully, Tsunagi is there, sitting alone on the bench. Kasaka tells her he'd go wherever she's chosen to go, just because he doesn't want her to be alone. The movie cuts to them both sitting on a train silently. From there on, Kasaka follows her through an empty station, and out to an empty city. The fog threatens to engulf everything in view as they silently walk through a forest towards a lake. This is the same area where Tsunagi's mother had chosen to meet. It is Kasaka who chooses to break the silence. He gently assures her that even after the treatment he would remain the same. He tells Tsunagi that once they're both treated, they would stop being controlled by something else and get rid of the illusion. Upon hearing this, Tsunagi is enraged. She furiously asks him what was wrong with the illusion. Did he not care if it went away? Kasaka cannot answer. This makes Tsunagi angrier and she walks into the lake ready to... But Kasaka catches hold of her and pulls her back. Bitter and upset, she bursts into tears. She asks him if the parasite was controlling her mind, then who was in her heart? She breaks down as she explains that she had never fallen in love with anyone until she met him. The extraordinary feeling she got when their hands touched, or when he'd accidentally hit her, was too great to ignore. For the first time, she believed she was in love because she missed him when he was not there with her. While saying all this, she was prepared to rather than lose her heart. But now, she cannot bear the thought of being erased from Kasaka's heart or mind. Hearing this, Kasaka reaches forward and hugs her as she cries out loudly. He tells her he'd go happily with her even if she chooses, but that makes her more miserable because she doesn't want him to. Slightly laughing, Kasaka also relates to her about how she became the center of his life. In fact, she was the one who gave him a life and he thanks her for it. He assures her that everything was going to be fine. After all, they were diplozoids, conjoined together because they couldn't bear to part. This leads the two of them to kiss. At the lake's edge, they watch Izumi as he arrives. The man is clearly sad as he tries splashing in. The movie cuts to Kasaka lying on a hospital bed. Tsunaga's grandfather is standing beside him and tells him that the parasite was successfully removed from his brain. This immediately jolts Kasaka awake despite his anesthesia, and he yells at the doctor for forcing an operation on them that neither he nor Tsunagi had wanted. The doctor doesn't reply but just turns on a projector reel depicting Tsunagi. She stares at the camera blankly as the doctor explains that it was her will to go through with the treatment. Both operations performed had been successful. The movie cuts to Kasaka gradually shifting back to his old life. He is not plagued by germophobia anymore and can now hang out with other people without having panic attacks. He soon gets an office job, where his boss continuously praises him for his talent. His rehabilitation back into human life is apparently successful. Only this time, Tsunagi is nowhere to be seen around him. At an office party, a coworker appraisingly asks him what project he's currently working on, and he tells her that he has recently developed a conversational artificial intelligence app that can reply with positive comments. It has the ability to learn at a fast pace and can provide relief from stress to those suffering from it. He also reveals that he has also developed a simple game for Christmas. Suddenly, he is interrupted by a phone call from Izumi. Izumi asks him if Tsunagi was with him, and Kasaka gets shocked. Apparently, she had disappeared without a trace when she went to school 3 days ago, and now the police cannot locate her. Kasaka asks Izumi if the treatment had made her better, but Izumi can only say he thought it had until she disappeared. Kasaka and the audience come to the realization that Tsunagi has decided to walk over the edge of the lake. While Kasaka grieves for her back in his room, he finds an envelope on his desk. It carries some cash and a letter that Tsunagi had written for him a few weeks after being released from the hospital. In it, she describes how her memories and feelings for him were gradually fading away. Yes, she can finally order a hamburger at a restaurant all alone by herself, and he probably can go ride a train without gloves. Yes, she still remembers his bedroom and the smell of disinfectant it carried so heavily. She remembers the time they had spent together, but she can no longer feel strongly about it. She is sure that if they were to meet again, they would be strangers to each other. So before that happens, she thanks him one last time and says goodbye. Kasaka can do nothing but stare at the letter and bitterly cry. If the worm had really created an illusion between them, then he wonders, why does he feel so much despair? Towards the end, Kasaka reveals that the virus he had created had a bug in it that wouldn't allow it to function properly. Yet he had decided to release it onto the world. An incomplete virus, just like he was. The movie cuts to Izumi, who is analyzing Kasaka's blood samples. In it, he discovers that the parasite had laid an egg before it was removed. This prompts him to reveal a grand revelation to Tsunagi's grandfather. Initially, they had wondered what would happen to the worm if it wasn't able to copulate. Would it find another lover, or would it cease to exist? Looking at how Izumi was still alive, despite having a worm in him, the truth was that the worm continued on inside him, proving that humans and worms can coexist. With that ominous revelation, Izumi leaves while the doctor agitatedly throws the reports away. On the 24th, Kasaka makes his way to the Christmas tree that both he and Tsunagi had planned to see once, a really long time ago. At exactly 7 p.m. the virus would activate and cut off networks on all infected devices. Traffic lights and all utilities will cease to function and the world will fall into chaos. It was going to be a world Tsunagi had always wanted to see. As the countdown narrowed to 0, Kasaka expected the hall to fall into darkness. Instead, the lights remain on, and the Christmas tree sparkles with a brilliant light show. Suddenly, Tsunagi walks out from behind him and remarks how disappointed she was. She had planned to watching the world fall into chaos, but he had ruined everything. Kasaka can only apologize now as they watch everyone's happy faces. He admits to her how weird he feels in places like this, and she teasingly agrees. He also admits how jeans look terrible on her, and she tells him to shove off. They both watch the Christmas lights when suddenly the virus activates and sparks start flying everywhere. People leave the building in a state of mass panic. Kasaka and Tsunagi, however, remain standing, never to leave each other's side even if the world falls into chaos and despair. They kiss and the movie ends.